CFUMC family, welcome to Matt Talk, but with a twist. I'm not Pastor Matt, but don't adjust your screens. We haven't been hacked. I'm Reverend Gia Jones, Associate Pastor here at Coming First United Methodist Church. And today, I've been handed the mic, or maybe borrowed it. Let's just say I'm guest hosting with permission. We're doing something a little special this week. Instead of Matt giving the talk, I'll be the one in the hot seat. And who better to interview me than someone that is familiar to all of us, the Reverend Dr. Brandon Harris.
All right, I'm going to try not to make this too hot.
Okay. We're diving into this season of Thanksgiving. 2 words, talking about God's extravagant generosity and what it means to respond with our own. So let's settle in and let's get into it.
All right.
Take it away, Brandon.
Well, we've been talking about generosity in November, and this season of Thanksgiving. Generosity is a response to God's extravagant work in our lives. From a biblical perspective, our lives and our livelihoods, every blessing that we have comes from the Lord. The passage I always turn to talk about this is Psalm 24:1. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. But you can really go all the way back to Genesis, and you see right there in those creation stories that nothing that exists came to be except by the work of God. Ultimately, everything derives from the Lord. So I'd love to take you back to a time in your life when you really became aware of God's extravagant generosity, kind of that blessing that poured into your life.
So I can recall when I was in seminary and I gave up my full-time job and I became a full-time student. And there was a time in that seminary journey that I did not have the funds to pay my tuition. And I remember praying to God. It was a Saturday morning, and I remember praying to God and asking for God's guidance and God's help. And I believe it was maybe just a few hours later, I got a call that said, hey, there's a donation here of quite a bit for your tuition. And I was like, oh, wow, this is just amazing. And then, so that was Saturday. Sunday morning, I got another call to say, here's an additional donation towards your tuition that doubled the overall amount.
Wow.
And so while I know who made the donations, for me, it was not about those individuals, but about how God was being extravagantly generous in my life.
Well, you need to do more praying. It sounds like that really is remarkable. Yes. Well, tell me about how that realization shaped your giving.
Well, that moment, it changed everything for me. Up until that time, I saw generosity and giving mostly as, something that you're supposed to. You want to be a good Christian. This is what you're supposed to be doing. And it changed where after that experience, that kind of unexpected, overwhelming, extravagant generosity from God, I started to see giving as a response to grace. I realized that God saw me, God cared about my needs, God was concerned about what was going on with me and was already at work.
Yeah.
Doing for me and providing for me in ways that I couldn't even imagine. And it gave me this desire to want to have that same spirit of freely and joyfully and generously and even sacrificially giving, not out of guilt or habit, but out of a deep gratitude.
Yeah, and that's I think that's really fascinating. You experience God's prevenient grace through this generosity that was just overflowing, and you felt called to respond, not just out of a token, but out of a deep sense of gratitude, and that turned into financial generosity. As John the Evangelist puts it, we see God's love poured into us in remarkable ways. He says, God so loved the world that He gave. He gave us His only Son. We've already talked about how God's generosity precedes our own, and here we see that God's generosity is so extravagant that he gives us his first and only. That should impact our response, no?
Right. God gave his first. God gave his best. And when I really stopped to reflect on that, it challenges me to consider what it may look like to do the same in my own life. When I first started giving, it was shaped by my family, what I learned from my family. I grew up in a home where generosity was something that was really valued. I can recall my grandmother saying this scripture that came from Ecclesiastes. It says, "Cast your bread upon the water." And then my grandmother would in turn say, "My mother said that to me, and I'm going to say it to you. I'm passing it down to you. Be generous and don't worry about how it's going to come back to you because God will bless you." And so over time, especially as I experienced God's generosity in my life, and especially with that tuition, when I didn't have the funds in seminary, I knew it was, God provided that more than I needed within 24 hours. And I began to see generosity and giving not just as a family value or a spiritual duty, but as a personal response to God's love. God has been extravagantly generous with me, and often in ways that I never saw coming. And that's made me want to, in my own giving, reflect who I believe God is. I don't want to give out of obligation. I don't want to give because, that is just simply some family value that I was taught. I want to give because I'm saying to God, I see what you've done, and I trust you, and I'm grateful. And I want my giving to say something about who I believe God is, and that's not always been the case. I want to give like someone who knows what it means to receive God's first and God's best.
That's really fascinating and powerful. Matt and I last week talked about the journey from sort of obligation to joy. And, what you're describing actually takes us all the way back to one of the earliest stories in the Bible, the story of Cain and Abel. They both brought offerings to God, but there's a clear difference between their offerings. Abel was, it says, a keeper of the sheep, and Cain was a tiller of the ground. And when they brought their offerings, it says that Abel brought the firstborn of his flock, but then Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground. So it's not that crops were bad. There's obviously nothing wrong with that. I mean, my son never eats his vegetables, but there's nothing wrong with the offering of the fruit of the ground. It's just that Abel, he was offering an offering of faith and trust, his first, while Cain's offering was simply just a portion. It was just some, and it's almost as if they were an afterthought. And I've always been struck by the way Genesis tells that story, because it doesn't say that God rejected Cain's gift because it was small or unworthy. It says that God regarded Abel's gift with favor and Cain's with indifference. The difference was the heart behind their giving. God wasn't measuring the amount or even the item that was given. He was measuring and looking at the attitude of the giver.
Exactly. It's not about the size of the gift. It's about the posture of our hearts. And Abel's offering said, God, you are first. Everything I have comes from you, and I trust you with it. And Cain says, here's what's left. After I've taken care of what I need, after I've made sure that everyone else in my family is good and all that. And I've had seasons in my life where, honestly, I've done the same. Yeah. I've done both. But when I've chosen to give God my first, before I knew how everything else would work out, it just brought such peace. It's like giving becomes a declaration of trust. God, you've been faithful before, and I know that you will be faithful again. You'll continue to be faithful.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, that's the heart of what Scripture calls first fruits giving. Throughout the Old Testament, this principle shows up again and again. When Israel came into the Promised Land, for instance, God told them in Deuteronomy 26 to bring the first of all the fruit of the ground and present it as an offering before the Lord. It was their way of saying, God, this land, this harvest, this blessing, it all belongs to you first. It wasn't just an agricultural act. In fact, it was an act of worship. I mean, they would stand before the altar and they would say, my father was a wandering Aramaean. And they would tell this story of God's faithfulness, his extravagant love and generosity that had poured into them. And so this wasn't just about giving the fruit of the ground. It wasn't just about the crops. It was about remembering that everything they had was the result of God's generosity and his grace in their lives.
That's so beautiful. It's not just an offering, it's a story.
Yeah.
And when I think about first fruits now, it's not just about a paycheck or an amount. It's about starting with gratitude. It's saying, God, I've seen what you've done. I remember where I've been and how far you've brought me. That kind of giving changes how I see everything else in my life. And honestly, that shift in putting God first changes how I live. So when I begin my month, when I begin my week, when I begin my day, giving back to God, it centers me. It reminds me that I'm not the source of my blessings, God is. And that frees me to live with more open hands and less anxiety.
That's such an important point, Gia, because if we're honest, most of us tend to give God what's safe, what we know we can spare. But first fruits giving turns that pattern on its head. It says, I'm not waiting to see what's left. I'm starting by giving what's first. I mean, and that's not just generosity, it's trust. Yes. It's a way of saying, God, you're the provider, not me. So my security doesn't come from what I hold on to, but from who holds on to me. And when you think about it, that's exactly how God has loved us. I mean, he didn't wait to show how we would respond before he gave. He gave first, and he gave his first and best. Again, as John says, God so loved the world that he gave his only son. And God's generosity, as you experienced in your own life, God's generosity always precedes ours. Our giving isn't just a response, it's a reflection of that divine generosity.
Yes. And I think that's why giving feels like worship for me. It's not a transaction. It's a response to love. And so when I give of my first and my best, I'm saying, God, I trust you. I honor you. I'm grateful for what you're already done. And the more I practice that, the more I get into that, the more I notice how God's generosity continues to be present for me. It's like giving opens up my eyes to see the abundance that was there all along.
That's such a beautiful reminder, Gia, because first fruits giving isn't about God needing something from us. In fact, newsflash, God doesn't need our money.
Exactly.
It's about us needing to remember who God is and how generous he's always been. So when we start with gratitude, our giving becomes a joyful act of worship.
That's well said. Well said. I want to remind all of us our theme this November is Thanksgiving. That's 2 words. We're exploring God's blessings and what it looks like to give thanks and honor him. We're also exploring how giving is a central part of that response. So I hope you'll join us in reading the scriptures and praying using the devotional resources available on our website and in the description below and on social media. This week, the scripture focuses on the ways that the people of God have responded by putting God first. And as you reflect this week, I want to encourage you to think about what it means for you to give your first and your best to honor God, not just with what's left, but with the first of what you have. That can mean your time, your attention, your resources, whatever it is. But when we put God first, it reshapes everything else. Because when we give God our first and our best, we're not just offering a gift or echoing the heart of the gospel. The God who gave his first and his best for us invites us to live with that same kind of open-handed trust. And that, more than anything, is what true worship looks like. Well, friends, that's it for this special Gia Talk.
Oh, okay.
I mean Matt Talk.
Maybe we should have more.
Matt Talk. Thank you to the Reverend Dr. Brandon Harris for being our guest today and for the great conversation.
Oh, it's such a pleasure.
And for helping us reflect on what it really means to give our first and our best to God. Not just leftovers, but gifts that come from our heart, a heart of trust and gratitude. See you next time.